At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
We're going to get started. Welcome to the School of Public Policy here at Pepperdine. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean here of the Graduate Policy School, and it's great to see so many of you here joining us for the 2018 Constitution Day lecture. Our Constitution Day lecturer, Bill Simon, and I share a common native state of New Jersey. And where we come from, it seems as if every other town has a sign, Washington slept here. That's kind of one of the running jokes, that Washington slept everywhere, apparently, around New Jersey. The region really is immersed in our founding history, and I'm just back from being out there this past weekend. Bill and I actually grew up fairly close to one another. But still, while there's no way our founders could have imagined a nation which could include a place like Malibu within its borders, they most certainly understood what kinds of challenges a democratic republic they conceived in the Constitution would face. In most all cases, their concerns focused not so much on the nation's first decades, but on the nation's first centuries. So here we are, over 2 centuries later, and there is much talk these days about whether we'll actually be able to pass on this republic to citizens like my 6-year-old daughter, Elsa. That's part of what I'm doing, actually. Anything I can do to work in my daughter's name, I'm just trying to find a way to do it. So, Googling the phrase democracy crisis in America results in 105 million hits. Topped by an essay in The Atlantic this week by former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, titled, well, American democracy is in crisis. Missing from Secretary Clinton's list of reasons why our democracy teeters on the precipice is the one many of our founders worried about, and the one Bill will be speaking about today. It was the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville during his travels throughout the United States 50 years after the Constitution was ratified, in which he observed, quote, religion in America takes no direct part in government of society, but it must be regarded as the first of its political institutions. For if it does not impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it, unquote. The question of how a democratic republic sustains itself is one which precedes our founding and continues through today. It is timely then that on this Constitution Day to have Bill Simon provide our annual lecture, which he's titled Making Freedom Last, the Role of Religion in Sustaining Our Republic. Bill Simon is a businessman, philanthropist, gubernatorial candidate, and educator who recently received the My Last Lecture Award at UCLA for his outstanding teaching in their economics department. He's the author of several books, including Living the Call, an introduction to the lay vocation with his late friend and former SPP professor, Michael Novick, and the recent Great Catholic Parishes. He's a longtime friend and supporter of SPP and a longtime friend of mine. Please join me in welcoming our 2018 Constitution Day lecturer, Bill Simon.
Thanks, Pete. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I speak from the heart in thanking you all for coming. And I'm a little overcome right now because as I drove up here today, I saw the Charlie Runnels Sports Complex. Charlie's an old friend, like Rosemary Licata. And, I begin to think about, the passage of time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But I have to say, I love Pepperdine. I love, love, love Pepperdine. My wife and I live in Pacific Palisades. So it's not far from here, as you know. And it's an awful pretty drive. And any day that I get to make that drive and come here to Pepperdine is automatically a good day. Our daughter Lulu went to Oaks Christian, so I made that drive a lot of times because now you go left right over Malibu Canyon Road. And I just have so many fond memories. My dad spoke here in the 90s about his faith. Jim reminded me that I spoke here a couple of years after that. Jim was kind enough to confer an honorary degree on me and in the School of Public Policy. And the truth is that I was sitting on the dais at the exercises. I was going to be the commencement speaker. And I was looking at the ocean and saying, this is maybe the greatest front lawn in higher education. And I was noticing how beautiful a day it was, and I was daydreaming. And somebody elbowed me in the ribs and said, "You have just been introduced." And I could see my wife looking at me for the first row like she was going to kill me. So anyway, it's great to be here, and for many, many, many reasons. And I want to talk a little bit about, as Pete said, the importance of faith, the importance of religion. I'm a Catholic, and so these have been challenging times, as I'm sure you've all read, with grand jury reports and, many scandals, which unfortunately mostly are true. But that doesn't mean that religion's not important. Just like our country, our faith, whatever our faith tradition happens to be, goes through its ups and downs, at least as far as the public goes. But through thick and thin, for 2,000 years, the Catholic tradition has been alive. Not always well, but alive. And just like other traditions that have hundreds of years of history and great thinkers and great spiritual exercises, there is so much wealth. And it's another reason I'm grateful to be here at Pepperdine, because you celebrate the importance of faith. I remember the New York Times. I sometimes say, a paper that shall remain nameless. But if you guessed the New York Times, you'd be correct. Some years ago, I read an article in the New York Times that said, the Pepperdine Law School has an absolutely outrageous approach. They actually focus on justice. They actually focus on what's right, as opposed to what you can get away with if you're a really clever lawyer. And I'm a lawyer, and I don't think I'm terribly clever, but I read that article and I thought, thank God for Pepperdine Law School. So, I want to go back a little bit. I want to go back to September 1787. Our founding fathers were signing a constitution to establish a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. 231 years later, we the people are still in charge, although sometimes it may not look like it. It's a quite extraordinary feat in the annals of human history. Today, in fact, we've got the oldest written constitution in the world, thanks in large measure to our founders' profound understanding of human nature, which probably hasn't changed a lot since 1787. In this lecture, I want to consider some of their key assumptions of the founders in creating a more perfect union that would endure, for that was their vision. And it was the reason so many brave men fought against the British at such great odds in our War of Independence, as we see in the following account. In 1843, a young Massachusetts scholar was doing research on the American Revolution, and he interviewed a gentleman named Captain Levi Preston. He was a 91-year-old Yankee, and he had fought at both Lexington and Concord. Captain Preston, the young man, began, "What made you go to Concord in 1775? What did I go for?" Preston asked. The scholar said, "Were you oppressed by the Stamp Act?" "I never saw any stamps," Captain Preston replied, "and I always understood that no stamps were ever actually sold." Well, what about the tea tax? The scholar asked. Tea tax? I never drank a drop of tea. In fact, the boys threw it all overboard. But I suppose, the scholar said, you've been reading Harrington, Sidney, Locke about the eternal principle of liberty. I never heard of those guys, Captain Preston said. The only books we had were the Bible, the Catechism, Watts' Psalms, and the hymns and the almanacs. Well then, what was it? The scholar asked Levi Preston. He responded, he said, what we meant in going for those redcoats was that we had always been free, and we meant to be free always. And they didn't want us to be. Always free. Free always. The magnificent daring of that thought itself deserves thought. For one thing, in terms of the origins of freedom, the story shows clearly that Captain Preston's sense of freedom, a freedom for which we would live and die, was not derived from either the great declarations, such as the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence, or from even great ideas, such as the writings of John Locke and Edmund Burke. For Captain Preston and Americans just like him, freedom was something that de Tocqueville called habit of the heart. It was part of their birthright, part of their DNA, as we would say today, as natural to them as the New England air that they breathed. Captain Preston clearly believed something quite extraordinary and utterly audacious in human history. Along with our American framers and many of his generation, Captain Preston believed that it was possible to become free, to live free, and stay free forever. But were they right? Can freedom last forever? And if so, how? And maybe most importantly, what are we doing today to ensure that it does last? So in 2018, where we are now, 2.5 centuries after the revolution secured our freedom, that great question and issues that surround it deserve maybe a little closer attention. Freedom is the special glory of America, the chief boast of Americans, and beyond any doubt, the central reason for the importance of America and for the democratic project, for the modern world, and indeed for all humanity. From its very beginning, the United States was blessed with a sturdy birthright of freedom. It was born in freedom, it expanded in freedom, and it resolved its great conflicts in a new birth of freedom. Can Americans now assume that freedom's past is a sure guarantee of America's future? I don't think so. In Abraham Lincoln's immortal words in the Gettysburg Address, he said, "Are we still testing whether this nation can long endure?" The evidence of history suggests that it's harder to be free than to become free. And that's one of the deepest reasons why freedom has been snuffed out in times past and why eternal vigilance is always the price of freedom. But what is sure is that our generation must answer these questions now if we were to hand on the torch of freedom, burning as brightly as it did for Captain Preston and millions of people since then. So allow me this afternoon to set out some issues that we really should think about in order to ensure that this freedom remains. The founders recognized several separate tasks in establishing a free republic that would remain free. One of those tasks is pretty obvious: winning freedom, as they did in the War of Independence. Another task is less obvious, but equally important, in some ways tougher: ordering freedom. Once you win it, how do you get organized? That's symbolized by the Constitution in 1787 and the Bill of Rights in 1791. But the third task of those three, probably the most difficult of all, is sustaining freedom. This is the challenge of the centuries and the ongoing duty of each generation, reaching down into their own day and into the future, because the defense of freedom never rests. Benjamin Franklin addressed this task when he came out of the Constitutional Convention and was asked by a certain Mrs. Powell, what sort of government, you know this one, right? Yes. What sort of government had they given to America? A republic? If you can keep it. You will get an A on my test. Nice going. Let's give a round of applause. But that's important, right? If you can keep it. I feel like saying that to my kids, which are not kids anymore. They're not as young as Pete's kids. So all three of these tasks need understanding today, because our tendency, the human tendency, is to make sure that, you know, everything's fine today, but they forget where they came from. So, for example, in 1789 and 1917, two governments were overthrown. The French government in the French Revolution, and the Russian government in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They accomplished that first task. They won freedom, but they failed in the second of the three tasks. They did not order freedom, and both revolutions ended up spiraling down into murderous disorder and disarray. Their freedom did not last. In contrast, our American framers created, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, a government that is rational, well-tempered, in order to ensure liberty, with a profound understanding of how to harness human nature to constructive ends. The founders understood that in sustaining freedom, it required, as we said a moment ago, these habits of the heart, muscle memory, if you know physical fitness. They knew from the beginning, as Abraham Lincoln warned a half-century later, that the threat to America would not come from outside. It comes from inside. Those habits are the heart. Lincoln, in fact, declared in 1838, quote, "If danger ever reach us, it must spring up from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." End quote. In that same speech, President Lincoln spoke of what he called the silent artillery of time. Given the passing of time, even the revolutionary becomes routinized, and the habits of the heart grow weaker and weaker. One of the most poignant stories of the ancient world is the account of the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who at the moment of his greatest victory, when he conquered Carthage, was weeping. And someone said to him, "Why are you weeping?" And he said, "Because I imagine the day when someone will do the very same thing to Rome." How extraordinary, said his tutor Polybius, to whom Scipio was speaking, that on the day of his greatest success, he should have been aware of his own mortality and the transience of life. Scipio was a rare conqueror who did not need anyone to whisper in his ear, "This too shall pass." Eternal vigilance. The same sense of transience lies at the heart of Polybius' own work, the Histories, which Thomas Jefferson and James Madison knew so well. Throughout history, as Polybius observed, all republics have risen, prospered, and fallen. Indeed, there was what he called a regular cycle of constitutional revolution and adorned decay and change. So it's a tough job to resist the natural course of human events. The most important of the three great classical sources of decay was what Polybius called corruption of customs. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. A similar idea, corruption of customs, to what de Tocqueville said, habits of the heart, involve foundational morals, foundational standards, foundational traditions, and not forgetting where we came from. The framers, in their work, sought to avoid the previously inevitable corruption of customs and set up what they called a new science of politics as a direct answer to the fatalism of Polybius's analysis. As men of the Enlightenment, these framers were optimists, but they were also realists. The American Republic was going to be the first great republic since the fall of Rome. The term they used was nova ordo, a new order. But while it is clear from the writings of the founders that they had indeed studied political systems of every type, they sought to study history in order to defy history, unlike what happens too often now in our academies. More specifically, they had a dream. They had a clear and ingenious idea about how the American Republic could break that inevitable cycle and beat the historical odds. The United States was going to be a great experiment. Don't worry, I've done that many times. The United States was going to be a great experiment in George Washington's oft-repeated words. They sought not only to win and order freedom, but also, and equally important, to sustain freedom. The United States, they hoped, would be a free republic that would remain free. So let's think about what their solution was. What was the basis for their optimism that was grounded in realism? It was certainly not a belief in democracy. Does that sound unusual? They didn't think democracy in and of itself would ensure sustaining freedom. In fact, you know what John Adams said? Quote, "There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Remember that? James Madison was equally gloomy. He said, "Democracies have always been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and as short in their lives as they've been violent in their deaths." So if you ask most scholars today, most Americans, to spell out the framers' solution, you know, the answer might be separation of powers, checks and balances. A strong constitution, they would say, is the sole necessary antidote to sustaining freedom. However, wrong. This reliance on the Constitution alone is flawed and not consistent with thousands of years of history. Now, it's true that our constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances is an essential, distinctive form of our government. But our founders were profoundly skeptical of people with power, and they wisely put in safeguards against the weaknesses of human nature, which they understood only too well. But this was only part of the solution the framers devised for countering the corruption of customs that Polybius had warned against. Polybius said that documents in and of themselves will not guard against the corruption of customs. He wrote, and I quote, "When a commonwealth, after warding off many great dangers, has arrived at a high pitch of prosperity," sound familiar? "And undisputed power," sound familiar? "The manner of life of its citizens will become more extravagant," sound familiar? "And that rivalry for office," sound familiar? "And other spheres of activity will become fiercer than it ought to be." Do we ever see our fierceness around here today? "And as this state of circumstances grows stronger and stronger, this fierceness, this will prove the beginning of a great deterioration." So if the framers' reliance either on democracy or on separation of powers was not absolute, what was the other missing piece of the puzzle? We're finally getting to the guts of it now. It was a concept that the ancients and scholars and politicians since then have often referred to as the eternal triangle of first principles. Three interlocking and interdependent ideas that were viewed as absolutely foundational to sustaining freedom. The three legs are liberty, virtue, and religion. The premise is that each leg requires the other leg. Liberty requires virtue. Virtue requires faith, and faith requires liberty. With this concept in mind, we can clearly see the heart of the framers' brilliant view of the indissoluble link of faith and freedom. Now I want to expand briefly on each of these three legs of the eternal triangle. But let me stress that I'm not arguing that all framers and founders were people of faith, let alone orthodox faith, or that they even agreed on a place of religion in public life. Clearly, they all demonstrated great diversity of thought on these issues. But on the underlying relationship of faith and freedom, they showed remarkable unity, almost without exception. So the first leg of the triangle, liberty, requires virtue. For the framers, liberty was not just a form of negative freedom, a freedom from. You don't have to do something. Rather, it was a positive freedom, a freedom to do, a freedom to become. In Lord Acton's famous formulation, freedom is not the permission to do what we like, but the power to do what we ought. In a similar vein, Benjamin Franklin once said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom." Or in James Madison's observation, we see clearly that the father of the Constitution did not rely on the Constitution alone, even the author. He said, "Is there no virtue amongst us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose any form of government will secure liberty and happiness without virtue is a chimerical idea." John Adams was equally blunt. He wrote, quote, "We have no government, armed with forces capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge would break the strongest cords of the Constitution as a whale would go through a net." In sum, the founders recognized that a system of free government was a product of virtue rather than a source of virtue. They further understood that the survival of our fragile republic in those years depended upon the moral and civic virtue of a people who were willing to set aside self-interest and to exercise restraint in the service of the common good. So that's the first leg. Second leg, virtue requires religion. For the framers, virtue was more all-encompassing than many view virtue in today's society. For one thing, it included strong features such as excellence and courage. For another, it had to be grounded and rooted. It was not a cliche that somehow floated in the air. Religion provided virtue with its content, its inspiration, its sanction. As George Washington himself said in his farewell address, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits that lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Or, as the more skeptical Mr. Jefferson asked equally clearly, quote, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis?" A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God. Jefferson saying that our liberties, which we've enjoyed for hundreds of years, came from God. Can you imagine the ACLU acknowledging that today? Jefferson's great rival, John Adams, certainly agreed with him, at least on this point. He said, Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. That's the second leg. We're going good. The third leg of the triangle is that religion requires liberty. Here, and not in the separation of powers, is perhaps where the framers were the most original and the most daring. Indeed, I think it could be argued, and there's many scholars here today that would know better than me, that the first 16 words of the First Amendment are the most daring and distinctive part of the entire American ordering of public life. This was an unprecedented break from 1,500 years of history, from the time when Constantine ordained Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 317 AD. As Madison himself argued powerfully in his memorial in Remonstrance, quote, "The torrents of blood that have been spilled in the name of established religion in the old world, but now we have the true remedy in our documents, the separation of church and state." Its underlying principle in Madison's words are, quote, "that religion, or the duty that we owe our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence." Madison further argues that the establishment of religion is both unnecessary and unwise. First, it's unnecessary because, as we all know, religion can rely on its own strength to flourish, thanks to our Creator. It's unwise because when religion becomes established, as we know, it can become oppressive and coercive. No fair-minded reader of the writings of the framers can possibly miss their extraordinary chorus of agreement, no matter what their belief was on these issues. So it seems beyond dispute, you would think, that faith or religion not only occupied a preeminent place in the foundation of our republic, but should today as well. Skeptics, however, in those days, would say, this is just hyperbole, or as John Adams said, pious cant. I had to look up what that meant. The framers said expressly that it was not. Were they merely children of their times, our framers? Far from it. Nowhere is the difference between the founders and their contemporaries in France more stark than when it came to how they framed themselves with respect to religion. Do you know what the cry of the French revolutionaries was? Quote, "Let us strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest." So the American framers had a little different idea, right? So they were not product of their times. There were other people during those times that were anti-religion. But it's very plain that many Americans today have abandoned or are unmindful of the framers' position. Many of our contemporaries see religion not as promotive of freedom, but as oppressive. In fact, many of our liberal thinkers have adopted a position much closer to the French revolutionaries than to our American framers. And yet, as any student of history knows, it is irreligious regimes. Let's think Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, which have been the cruelest and least free for its citizens. So what has happened? What is behind the sea change between the framers' world and ours? Now, a full discussion on that topic would take us a little far afield today, but if you want, maybe I'll come back another time. But let me mention a couple of factors that I believe lie behind the controversies and the culture warring of the last, well, too many decades right now, right, Rosemary? One factor is a corrupted form of pluralism. The story of America, as we know, is the story of a steadily expanding pluralism. But at the same time, that pluralism is built on a foundation, as we talk, of unity. The motto of the Great Seal of the United States, first used in 1782, was E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Today, instead of diversity with each group contributing to the whole, we now unfortunately have groups fighting against each other, groups of every stripe. America's big tent has turned into a war zone. The second factor is what has been referred to as expanding statism, the larger role of the government. When the First Amendment, when those first 16 words were passed in 1791, religion was central and preeminent in people's lives, and the government was relatively small. Today, the best place to buy real estate is where? DC. Why? It never goes down. Why? The government only gets bigger. So today, the federal government's strong and central, and religion, for many, unfortunately, has become marginal and weak. And another factor is what we could call strict separationism. This view is pushed by groups, let's say, I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but one of my favorites is the ACLU, to pick on, that the separation of church and state must be strict and absolute. Clearly, to my mind at least, this was not what the founders had intended. To prohibit voluntary prayer before a school sporting event, for instance, seems to me to contravene the free exercise of religion, which is in those 16 words of the First Amendment. Does anybody here agree with that?
Yes.
There you go. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, we have turned the relationship between religion and freedom on its head, viewing them in conflict with one another, which is fundamental and a great misunderstanding of what freedom is, and a complete contravention to our eternal triangle. It's as if you had a triangle where the legs were kind of floating in thin air. Now I wonder, can we think aloud for a moment? Let's say that today was the day we were going to vote on the Constitution, and we were, waiting on the edge of our seat to what the folks in Washington would do. What do you think? Do you think "In God We Trust" would be on our dollar bill? No. This view of religion this view of the public square as a religion-free zone is a radical departure, because for the greater part of our history, America adhered closely to the framers' understanding of the First Amendment and the eternal triangle. Great leaders such as Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and President Ronald Reagan, following in the footsteps of the framers, continually reminded us that faith and religion are not just important to the character of our people, but important to our nation. Remember George Washington's words in his farewell address. Indispensable to the preservation of our democratic institutions was how he described religion. In 1917, Teddy Roosevelt, with his bully pulpit, wrote, and I quote, "In this actual world," of 1917, "a churchless community where men have abandoned or scoffed at or ignored their religious needs is a community on the rapid decline." Nearly half a century later, President Dwight Eisenhower said, quote, "Without God, there can be no American form of government, nor an American way of life." And most recently, President Ronald Reagan warned, quote, "If America ever ceases to be a nation under God, we will be a nation going under." But today, religion has become in public life, religion has become a religion-free zone, the public square. So that religion is considered something that must be inviolably private, as opposed to something that can be anywhere in the secular realm. In this world, according to the modern idea of freedom, unfettered choice is the ideal. The kingdom of private, I get to do whatever I want, is sacrosanct. Commitments are transient and provisional rather than permanent. And freedom from interference is what the focus is. Freedom from, as opposed to what Lord Acton and hundreds of people said, freedom for. Freedom to be the best person that you could be. Not surprisingly, modern freedom is all about rights, my rights, as opposed to responsibilities. Choices for ourselves, not choices to be our brother's keeper. Now, it would be easy to lament the present situation. We've gone from an animating vision which safeguards religion to one which systematically sabotages religion and undermines its revered traditions, honored place, and acknowledged importance in American society. Ironically, far-sighted framers such as John Adams foresaw this very outcome. Looking down the years, he mused on the clear threat of future generations losing their freedom if their leaders ever came to believe that humans were no higher than animals and the cosmos was without a father, end quote. Clearly, we have reached a point where the civil rights of those who preach and practice the most radical lifestyles, or who insist that all public places must be a naked public square, take precedence over the religious liberties of anyone who disagrees. We've even seen a case where the ACLU defended a group whose literature advocates sex between adult males and children. The same ACLU that works so hard to remove religion from our lives. We are indeed living in an upside-down world of Alice in Wonderland brought to life. When my good friend and former fellow here at Pepperdine, the late Michael Novick, addressed the Library of Congress in 1998, he was asked, can an atheist be a good American? His answer was yes. That has been done many times. But, he continued, can American liberties survive if most of our nation is atheist? The most common, almost universal judgment of the founders was it could not. My wife and Cindy had the great pleasure of going on our vacation a couple weeks back. We went to France. We had an opportunity to see some of the great cathedrals there. Boy, are they beautiful. Chartres, Notre Dame, Rouen, Bayeux. It was great. I marveled at all the art and the artistry. My wife is much more of an artist than I am. She can speak more articulately than me, as Rosemary knows. But I couldn't help but lament a fact that I had read about on the trip on the way over. About 50% of France is Catholic. Guess of that 50% go to church? 20? 5. So when you go into these cathedrals, they're beautiful pieces of art, but they're not places of worship. So I found that sad. And I said, I hope the day never comes when that'll be the case here, So in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, I believe the time has come for men and women to join and build a new consensus around religion's proper place in the public square. Okay, we know that the answer is not the naked public square or hundreds of years ago, the sacred public square. It's something that we need to be understanding of people that have different beliefs than we do and give respect to the proper place of religion. I believe we should move towards a civil public square in which citizens of all faiths and none are free to enter and engage in public life within constitutional first principles and a common vision of the common good within that eternal triangle. For example, if we are not to be an endlessly litigious people and seek all our solutions through law, we need to rebuild a consensus in our communities based upon what is just and free, as Pepperdine teaches at its law school, for people of all faiths. That eminently achievable consensus rests upon citizens who are steeped in the strengths of their freely chosen religious beliefs, as well as the other two legs of the eternal triangle, virtue and freedom. These are people who day in and day out do their best to live responsibly, provide for their families, and respect the liberties and rights of their fellow citizens. In other words, at a time when morality and virtue seem to be sadly in short supply, religion must play a greater, not a smaller, role in national life. And if it does, the future for America is as bright as the framers' hopes and dreams. If it does not, the consequences might be summed up in 3 words, as familiar to the ancients as it was to the framers: decline and fall. The noble experiment, as President Reagan used to love to say, that is America remains by its fundamental structure undecided from generation to generation. He said, will this generation be the ones to turn out the lights? Right, Pete? So we the people must therefore fight to return religion to its proper and foundational place in our country as the essential companion to liberty. In so doing, we must return our country to the vision our founders not only held dear, but for which they risked everything: their lives, their property, and their sacred honor. Because religious liberty is far more than just liberty for the religious. It is vital for all citizens. Putting religion back in the place the framers intended it is not just a policy item on the order of tax cuts, which of course I'm in favor of, or health care, or missile defense. Religion is taking care of our foundation. So religion in America is far from a private issue. Essentially, it is a national issue. So why does America need religion? It is not too much to say that as faith goes in America, so goes freedom. Long may faith and freedom march hand in hand in America. Thank you, and God bless you.
Let's give another round of applause. You know, I was reading the Daily Bruin article that noted the award that Bill received for his teaching. And Bill, you were quoted in there as saying that teaching has moved from a passion to a calling. And I think we all just witnessed that shift, that transition. And so thank you so much for responding to your calling, and thank you so much for the lessons that you've given us here. This concludes our formal part of our Constitution Day celebration. I want to welcome you all to the back, where we're going to be feasting on red, white, and blue cupcakes. For some of you as SEBR students, very great to have you up here. If you have any questions about our unique graduate program and why we're probably one of the only policy schools that hosts an annual Constitution Day celebration, we're happy to do that. Before we adjourn, I just want to thank a few people here. In particular, the room for which the name for which this is given, this auditorium, is Dean Jim Wilburn. Dean Wilburn is with us here this afternoon. So Dean, thank you so much for being with us here today. Dean Baird, Dean Emeritus from SEBR College, is also with us here today. Eminent historian, writer of a terrific history of Pepperdine in the 20th century. So Dean Baird, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. It is our annual when we're able to do this, when we're able to celebrate it, it is our tradition here at the Constitution Day celebration to celebrate one of our faculty members who reaches a particular milestone. And this year we celebrate with our own Dr. Ted McAllister his 20th anniversary here at the School of Public Policy. So please join me in thanking Dr. McAllister. And so this is a special place, as you say, Bill, and you're one of the reasons why this is a special place. And so I want to thank you not only for the support that you've given both directly and through your foundation to the building of this place, but also in the continued relationship and days like today. You discussed today really not only what makes America unique, but what makes this place unique as a policy school. We care about these things. And so thank you again for bringing this all together. So we are adjourned. Thank you so much for being with us, and please join us in the back. Thank you.